While I was fighting for my life in a hospital bed, my daughter, believing I wouldn't survive, gave my house as a gift to her in-laws. When I was finally discharged, I was met at the door with a shove. "You don't live here anymore," she shouted. What that ungrateful woman didn't know was that I always had an ace up my sleeve, a safety plan for a day like that. The next day, when I made my move, the game changed. She was no longer shouting at my door. She was on her knees on my new rug, begging for a forgiveness I would never grant. The hospital smell, even after days at home, refused to leave me. It clung to my clothes, my skin, and somehow, even my soul. I was Arthur. 70 years, well lived, or so I had thought until recently. I had spent nearly 2 weeks battling a brutal bout of pneumonia that had almost silenced me for good. Every breath was a struggle, every heartbeat a reminder of life's fragility. My only wish, as I lay in that cold hospital bed, was for the comfort of my home. The house I had built brick by brick with my beloved wife, Clara, the fortress of our memories, the sanctuary where I planned to live out the rest of my days. The image of our living room with the afternoon sun streaming through the window was what gave me the strength to fight, to draw one more breath. I longed for the smell of coffee brewing in my own kitchen, for the familiar texture of my old sofa. When the cab pulled up to the curb, a shiver ran down my spine. But it wasn't from the cold. It was a strange feeling, a premonition settling in my chest. The house, at first glance, looked the same, stately and welcoming. But something was off. A strange, dark sedan was parked in my driveway, occupying the spot where my car should have been. I'd asked my neighbor to keep an eye on it. My gaze then shifted to the yard, my wife's rose bushes, which bloomed in vibrant colors every spring and were Clara's pride and joy, had been ripped from the ground. Where a carpet of colorful petals once lay, there was now only overturned earth and a sense of emptiness. My heart clenched. What was happening here? Before I could even process the scene, the front door opened, and the person who greeted me was not my daughter, but my son-in-law's father, Mr. Miller. He was a man whose ambition I had always distrusted, with a smile that never reached his eyes. Now, that smile was even wider, almost a sneer. He sized me up with a look of poorly concealed triumph, a glint of satisfaction that sent a chill through me. His posture was that of a man who had won a war I didn't even know I was fighting. I tried to form a question, but the words stuck in my throat, choked by a rising confusion and a fear that was beginning to take root. Behind him, my daughter, Anna, appeared. Her face, once my greatest pride, a mirror of Clara's beauty, was now as hard as stone. Impassive, there wasn't a hint of joy in her eyes, not a trace of concern or relief at seeing me there, on my feet, after I had come so close to leaving this world. "Dad, you don't live here anymore," she said, her voice cold, cutting the air like a sharp blade. Each word was a shard of glass lodging itself in my chest. "I sold the house to my husband's parents. You're on your own." The ground seemed to vanish from under my feet. My world, already turned upside down by illness, now crumbled completely. I, fresh from a battle for my life, was now homeless, betrayed by my own flesh and blood. She blocked the doorway as if I were a stranger, an intruder in the house that was mine. That was the last piece of Clara I had left. The pain of those words hit me with the force of a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of me. My body, weakened by the illness, swayed slightly. Images of Clara, smiling among her roses, danced before my eyes, mixed with the coldness of Anna's stare. How could my daughter do something like this? How could she abandon me this way, especially now when I needed support the most? But amidst the searing pain of betrayal, a silent, calculating fury began to stir within me, burning like dormant embers. I had an ace up my sleeve, a detail that her greed and haste had made her forget, and she would beg for my forgiveness on her knees. I knew it. My mind, though clouded by exhaustion and shock, began to work, the gears of my old but still sharp brain starting to turn. I didn't know exactly what I would do, but I knew I would not be humiliated like this. That house was more than walls and a roof. It was the legacy of a lifetime, the sanctuary of a love that transcended death. I could not allow it to be torn from me so cruelly. As Anna watched me, her expression shifting between indifference and a strange determination, I felt a strength resurging, a resilience I thought I had lost in the hospital bed. The game had begun, and I was not one to quit. I swear my teary eyes locked with hers for a long moment, trying to find a trace of my little girl, the one I had rocked to sleep and taught to walk. But there, in that instant, was only a stranger. An invisible barrier had risen between us. My voice, still hoarse from my illness, uttered no plea, just a barely perceptible nod. I turned my back on the closed door, on the house I loved, on the daughter I hardly recognized. But I was not defeated. I was just getting ready, and she had no idea of the storm that was about to break. That first night, away from my home, was a whirlwind of emotions. The generic hotel room, with its crisp, impersonal white sheets, was a stark contrast to the cozy familiarity of my own bedroom, where memories of Clara still seemed to float in the air. The raw, searing pain of betrayal mingled with the physical exhaustion of my convalescence and the sheer disbelief of what had happened. I lay on the bed, my body heavy, but my mind on fire. Anna's cold words, "Dad, you don't live here anymore," echoed relentlessly, each repetition deepening the cut. How could my own daughter, to whom I had dedicated a life of love and sacrifice, be capable of such cruelty? The image of her rose bushes torn from the garden returned to my mind, a symbol of the devastation she had wrought upon my life. Clara's roses. What else had she destroyed in my absence? Hot, silent, bitter tears streamed down my face. They weren't tears of despair, but of profound sadness and a growing rage. It was in that moment of darkness that the pain of betrayal, instead of consuming me, converted into a plan of action, an iron resolve I didn't know I still possessed. I would not be the passive victim in this story, not after everything I had fought to build, not after everything Clara and I had dreamed of. The first ray of morning sun had barely appeared when I picked up the phone. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice was steady as I dialed my lawyer's number, Richard Almeida. He was a longtime friend, more than a professional, someone I trusted implicitly. Richard answered on the third ring, his voice still raspy with sleep. "Arthur, I thought you'd be home resting," he said, his tone one of genuine concern. My voice cracked a little as I recounted the events of the previous afternoon, but I quickly composed myself. As he listened to the story of the sale of my house and Anna's attitude, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "Richard, do you remember what we did with the house years ago?" I asked, feeling a glimmer of hope ignite amidst the darkness. The forgotten detail, the ace up my sleeve that the greed of Anna and her in-laws had made them overlook, was crucial. Years ago, on Richard's own advice and to protect the asset we valued so much, and most importantly, to ensure Clara's security if something happened to me, I had placed the house in a living trust. That trust, carefully drafted, granted me a life estate. This meant that as long as I was alive, the house was mine to live in and enjoy, regardless of who the nominal owner was. No sale, no real estate transaction would be legal without my signature, without my express consent to waive that right. There was a brief moment of silence on the other end, and then Richard's voice came through, sharper, more determined. "Arthur, my old friend, you're absolutely right. No sale would be valid without your formal waiver of the life estate. This changes everything." I felt an immense relief, a weight I didn't know I was carrying being slightly lifted. It was as if a cool breeze had swept through the stuffy, heavy air that surrounded me. Hope, which for a moment had seemed an unattainable luxury, now shone brighter. My mind, which had been in disarray, began to organize the pieces of the puzzle. Anna's betrayal, though painful, had a fundamental flaw, a flaw that I, with Richard's help, would use to my advantage. "I want you to act immediately, Richard," I said, my voice filled with a newfound determination. "I want you to notify Anna and the Millers. I want them to know that the house is mine, and that this sale is null and void." The next day, the legal notice arrived at my old house. I imagined the scene, could almost see it. Mr. Miller, with his air of superiority, the false tranquility of my daughter, Anna, and her in-laws. The delivery of that notice would be the shattering of their newfound peace, the collapse of the sandcastle they had built upon my pain. I knew the reaction wouldn't be one of immediate remorse, but something much more visceral. Something was beginning, and I felt that the first move had been made, but the game was far from over. The calm that came with the decision was merely the truce before the storm. I knew that the battle for my house, for my dignity, and perhaps even for my daughter's soul, was just beginning, and I was ready to fight. The legal notice sent by Richard landed like a bomb on the false tranquility Anna and the Millers had tried to build. I wasn't there to see it, but I imagined the scene with painful clarity. Mr. Miller's face contorted in a mixture of shock and anger, the look of panic that likely took over Anna. Her reaction, I knew, wouldn't be one of regret nor a sincere apology. No, fury would be the first emotion to surface, the fury of someone who feels cornered, whose meticulously crafted plan has suddenly been undone. Still in the hotel, the morning after the notice was delivered, my phone rang insistently. Anna's number flashed on the screen and my heart clenched. I took a deep breath, trying to brace myself for what was to come. When I answered, her voice was not the tearful one of a repentant daughter, but an enraged scream, tinged with desperation and threat. "Dad, what do you think you're doing?" she yelled, her voice distorted with anger. "You're ruining my life. How could you do this?" There wasn't a shred of guilt in her tone, only indignation and a sense of victimhood. She was accusing me, the victim of her betrayal, of ruining her life. The irony was cruel. I tried to remain calm, though each of her words was a stab. "Anna," I said, my voice low but firm, "that house is mine. It always has been. You had no right to sell it, much less to try and kick me out of it like this." My words, however, seemed to fall on deaf ears. She didn't want to hear reason, she only wanted to impose her will. "If you don't back down, Dad," she continued, her voice dropping to a darker, more menacing tone, "I'll expose business secrets from your past. Things you don't want coming to light. You know what I'm talking about." At that moment, the air in the hotel room seemed to thin. Secrets. What secrets? My mind began to race through the years, the decisions, the deals. I'd had a long and prosperous career with its ups and downs like anyone, but business secrets? That threat, instead of intimidating me, solidified my resolve even further. There was nothing in my past that could justify what she was doing, and her low tactics only revealed how desperate she was. With every word, the daughter I knew slipped further away, and a hardened, calculating woman took her place. As her fury bubbled on the other end of the line, I felt a strange clarity. This was no longer just about the house. It was about principles, about respect, about the truth. It was about what Clara would have done, and Clara would never have bowed to injustice. "Anna," I replied, my voice now carrying an authority I hadn't used with her in a long time, "do whatever you think you must, but know this. I am not backing down. I will not let you steal my home." And I hung up. The hand holding the phone was still trembling slightly, but the decision was made. That threat, instead of breaking me, had only given me more strength. If she wanted a war, she would have one. but I would fight with the truth, with the law. I knew Richard, my lawyer, would be surprised by her attitude, but he wouldn't doubt my determination. But the intrigue didn't stop there. While my daughter and I waged this personal battle, something even more complex began to unfold behind the scenes. Anna's in-laws, the Millers, were not people to accept a loss quietly. They had bought a house that legally couldn't be sold without my permission. The money, I knew, had already changed hands. When Richard's notice arrived, revealing the illegality of the transaction, their reaction was predictable. They felt deceived, tricked by their own daughter-in-law. Soon, the echoes of this new battle began to reach me through Richard, Anna's in-laws, feeling doubly betrayed. First, by the promise of a house that wasn't for sale, and second, by Anna's apparent complicity in hiding the life estate, had initiated a fraud lawsuit against her. The family dispute, which I had tried to keep as private as possible, was now becoming a public scandal, an intricate web of accusations and counter-accusations. The quiet plan of Anna and her husband had imploded, not just because of my intervention, but also due to the consequences of their own actions. I could feel the tension rising, the pressure mounting from all sides. The house, once a sanctuary, had become the center of a storm. I found myself thinking of Clara, of how she would react to all of this. Her strength, her dignity were a beacon for me now. I knew the journey would be long and painful, but I couldn't allow her memory to be tarnished by this greed. With each passing day, I realized the story ran much deeper than I had imagined, and that the next step would be crucial to unraveling the motives behind such audacity. I needed to understand why there was such a rush, such determination to get me out of my home, and I would do whatever it took to find out. What else was hidden beneath this plot of betrayal? I felt there was something more, something that hadn't yet been revealed. Anna's initial rage, the veiled threats about my past, and the subsequent legal action by the Millers against her, all left me with a sense of emptiness and a nagging question. Why? What was the true motivation behind such audacity? It wasn't just greed, or at least it didn't seem to be the only driving force. There was an urgency, a haste in her actions that didn't just fit with a desire for profit. I needed to understand the reason for that desperate rush, that unmeasured cruelty. It was as if Anna were cornered, acting under some pressure I couldn't yet discern. Still in my hotel room, whose walls seemed to close in with each passing hour, I decided I needed more than Richard's legal expertise. I needed eyes and ears where I couldn't be. I called Richard again, and after a long conversation about the developments in the Millers' lawsuit against Anna, I told him of my intention to hire a private investigator. Richard hesitated for a moment, understanding the gravity of what I was proposing, but seeing the determination in my voice, he eventually agreed and recommended a professional he trusted, a man named Elias Vance, known for his discretion and efficiency. Elias was a man of few words, with a sharp gaze that seemed to see right through my own doubts. I explained the situation to him, the sale of the house, the life estate, Anna's attitude, and the threats. Elias simply nodded, absorbing every detail without passing judgment. "I need to know what's behind this, Elias," I said, feeling a huge weight on my chest. "Why would my daughter do something like this? I can't believe it's just about money." Elias assured me he would do his work with the utmost caution. He understood the delicacy of the matter. After all, it involved my own family. The days that followed were a silent torture. The waiting was agonizing, every phone call making me jump, expecting news. I tried to fill the time by walking around the hotel, watching people, but my mind was always on my home, on Anna, on Clara. I felt like a spectator in my own life, watching a drama unfold without any control over the plot. Every evening, as the city lights came on, I felt more alone, more distant from everything I knew. The truth began to emerge slowly, in fragments of information that Elias sent me. And with each new piece of the puzzle, the picture that formed was darker than I could have imagined. My son-in-law, Mark, Anna's husband, was at the center of it all. Elias discovered that Mark was a man of expensive tastes, with an all-consuming passion for gambling. He was drowning in debt, making increasingly high-stakes bets, a financial hole that seemed to have no bottom. The sale of the house, which Anna had orchestrated with Mark's parents, was the only way to keep collectors from their door. It was a desperate attempt to pay off a colossal amount of debt that threatened to consume their lives. With each new piece of information, I felt a knot tighten in my throat. So that was it. Anna, my daughter, was acting under pressure from her husband, trying to save their marriage, perhaps even their family, from financial ruin. Compassion tried to rise in my chest, but it was quickly suffocated by the magnitude of the betrayal. She had chosen the easiest, cruelest path to strip me of my home instead of seeking help, of telling me the truth. But the biggest shock was yet to come. The obstacle became even greater when Elias brought me the most devastating piece of evidence of all. My daughter had forged my signature on a document waiving my life estate, a crude attempt to legalize the illegal, to circumvent the law and pull the wool over my eyes for good. A crucial document, a paper that should have borne my firm handwriting, but which Elias showed me had an almost childish imitation. The blood in my veins ran cold. This wasn't just a matter of a life estate, of an illegal sale. She had committed a crime to deceive me, to take me out of my own home. I wasn't just fighting for a roof over my head. I was fighting against a crime committed by my own daughter. It hit me with a deafening crash, fear, confusion, and fury mixed into an explosive cocktail in my chest. How could she? How could she cross that line, risk so much for a man who, from Elias's description, seemed not to be worth the ground he walked on? The weight of that revelation was almost unbearable. The pain of betrayal deepened, now tinged with the shadow of illegality. What else would I discover? What other chasms had my daughter dug for herself and for me? I felt that rock bottom had not yet been reached, and what came next could be even more painful. The revelation that my daughter had forged my signature on a legal document hit me like a lightning bolt. The initial shock gave way to a sense of numbness, as if my body refused to process such barbarity. Forging a signature wasn't just an act of disloyalty, it was a crime, a direct violation of the law, and more painfully, a violation of the trust I had placed in her my entire life. The pain of betrayal, already deep, now turned into an abyss of disillusionment. I felt not just deceived, but defiled. The Anna I knew, the sweet and caring girl, seemed to have been completely erased, replaced by a stranger capable of such dark acts. Richard, my lawyer, was shocked and indignant upon learning of the forgery. His usually calm and measured voice revealed a contained fury. "Arthur, this is extremely serious. Document forgery, especially in the context of a life estate, can have severe legal consequences for Anna." I knew, and the weight of that reality was crushing. It wasn't just my house at stake, but the future of my own daughter, which she herself had compromised. As the legal battle between the Millers and Anna intensified, and the evidence of my forged signature was being prepared, a small coincidence became an unexpected weapon in my hands. The in-law's lawyer, a Mr. Davies, was an old acquaintance of Richard's, not a friend, but a professional colleague, known for his questionable ethics and for using aggressive, often dubious tactics to win his cases. Richard had warned me about him on other occasions, mentioning cases where Davies had crossed the legal line, though without ever being caught. I remembered some conversations I'd overheard casually years ago at legal social events about Davies's reputation. There were rumors that he exploited loopholes, stretched the limits of the law, and even benefited from privileged information. At the time, that gossip seemed harmless. Now, it was the key to destabilizing my adversaries' defense and, more importantly, to sowing discord among them. With the help of Elias, the investigator, I began to weave my own web. I asked Elias to gather all the information he could on Mr. Davies's methods, his controversial cases, the veiled accusations that hung over his ethics. Elias, with his usual acumen, managed to find some old newspaper articles, reports that questioned certain strategies of Davies's, though without ever proving anything concrete. There were also some anonymous complaints on online legal forums, which, though not legal proof, indicated a pattern of behavior. Using my contacts in the press, contacts I had cultivated throughout my own career, I planted some of this information, not directly, not as a formal accusation, but as anonymous tips about the reputation of the lawyer representing the Millers in the fraudulent sale of a property. The idea wasn't to incriminate him directly, but to plant a seed of doubt in the journalists' minds, to generate buzz, to raise questions. The intention was simple: to destabilize the Millers' defense by diminishing their trust in Davies and, in doing so, to turn them against each other. The effect wasn't immediate, but gradual. Small notes began to appear in legal gossip columns and on specialized blogs, questioning the Millers' choice of a lawyer with such an ambiguous reputation. It wasn't long before the Millers themselves, already furious with Anna for the alleged fraud, began to doubt Davies's strategy. I imagined their meetings, the heated discussions, the growing mistrust undermining their alliance. If they couldn't trust their own lawyer, how could they have a cohesive defense? Richard, my lawyer, noticing the subtlety of my strategy, smiled slightly during one of our calls. "You still have your tricks, Arthur," he said, with a tone of admiration. I knew he understood that I wasn't acting out of malice, but out of necessity. It was a war, and I was using the weapons I had, within the bounds of the law, to protect what was mine and, in a way, to try to save Anna from herself. Despite all the strategy and the small victories, the anguish remained. I felt I was manipulating pieces on a complex chessboard, but every move, however calculated, had an emotional cost. My daughter was at the center of it all, entangled in her own lies and the consequences of her choices. I wondered if she realized how deep she had sunk, and if she would ever see the light. What else would Elias discover? I had a feeling that behind Mark's debts and the forgery, there was an even deeper layer of secrets, a hidden motive that had not yet come to light, and I felt I was about to find out. The days dragged on in the loneliness of the hotel room, each one laden with the weight of previous revelations. The pain of betrayal, the fury over the forgery, and the cunning needed to destabilize the opposing side had exhausted me. I felt a strange mix of weariness and a cold determination. My mind, once focused solely on recovering my health, now worked like a tireless engine, processing every detail, every move in this painful game. I watched the world through the window, people hurrying past, oblivious to the drama consuming my life. No one could imagine that an elderly man, fresh from a serious illness, was in the midst of such a complex legal and emotional battle against his own daughter. Despite all my maneuvers, the anguish persisted. I had hit the Millers and their lawyer, but Anna was still there, in the eye of the storm. And I couldn't free myself from the need to understand. Mark's motivation for the gambling debts was clear, but Anna's, for risking so much, for committing such condemnable acts, still seemed incomplete to me. There was a void, a gap in the explanation that my father's heart refused to fill with just the idea of saving her husband. I felt that she, on some level, was also a victim of something or someone. Elias, the investigator, continued his tireless work, a silent ghost unraveling the knots in the web of lies. He sent me concise reports, but each line was laden with information that I digested with apprehension. My life had become a constant wait for these small envelopes, which contained not just facts, but pieces of the truth I was seeking. The big twist, the one that completely changed my perception of the facts, came with Elias's final report, delivered on a grey afternoon. I opened the envelope with slightly trembling hands, a premonition of something bigger hanging in the air. And then I read. My daughter, the Anna I had judged so harshly, was not just the accomplice of a debt-ridden husband, she was being blackmailed. The name Elias brought to light was Sonia, a former business partner of Anna's in a venture that had failed years ago. A consulting firm they had tried to start together right after Anna's college graduation. At the time, I knew the business hadn't done well, and Anna had moved on, seemingly without major losses, but Elias had unearthed a hidden truth. During the final phase of that venture, Sonia and Anna had committed fraud, a small but significant tax fraud to try to save the business from imminent collapse, an act of desperation that, at the time, seemed to have no major consequences. But the evidence, carefully kept by Sonia, was now being used against Anna. My heart pounded in my chest. Sonia was threatening to expose this old fraud, which would not only ruin Anna's rising career at the company where she worked, but could also lead to serious legal implications. The sale of my house, then, was not just to save her husband from the clutches of his creditors, but also to save herself from a public scandal, from potential jail time, from a lifetime of work and reputation undone. It was the money from the sale that Sonia demanded, an exorbitant sum to keep her silent. Suddenly, the villain of my story was no longer a one-dimensional figure of greed and cruelty. She was also a cornered woman, making terrible decisions out of sheer panic. I pictured the terror in her eyes, the pressure of the past coming back to haunt her, the imminence of losing everything she had built. The figures of Mark, the inveterate gambler, and now Sonia, the ruthless blackmailer. Were the two walls closing in on my daughter? A wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. The anger at the betrayal was still there, but now it mixed with a deep sadness and a hint of understanding. She was desperate. It didn't justify her actions, of course not, but it humanized her monstrosity. The weight on her shoulders must have been unbearable. I, who had just fought for my own life, could feel an echo of the desperation that led her to commit those atrocities. The complexity of the situation deepened. I was not just fighting for a house, but for a daughter who, however wrong she was in a situation of extreme danger. Vengeance, the desire to see her pay for her actions, began to mix with an old urge to protect my daughter, to save her, even from herself. My father's heart, which I thought had hardened, began to soften, to fragment again. What decision would I make now? Could compassion be a weakness, or the key to a solution I couldn't yet see? The next step would be the most difficult of all, as it was no longer just about justice, but about family. And I knew the courthouse would be the stage for this final act, where the truth, however painful, would come to light for all to see. The revelation of Sonia's blackmail hung over me like a dark cloud, thickening the complexity of the whole situation. I saw myself, an elderly, sick father, in the midst of a whirlwind involving my home, my name, and now my own daughter's life. The image of Anna, once the unshakable villain, now merged with that of a cornered, frightened woman making terrible decisions under pressure. The fury, though still present, gave way to a deep melancholy, a mix of sadness and a remnant of paternal compassion. As much as she had hurt me, I was still her father, and the thought of seeing her ruined, not just by her own choices, but also by the cruelty of others, was unbearable. I spent days and sleepless nights pacing the small hotel room, replaying every detail of Elias's report, the tax fraud, Anna's panic, Sonia's ruthless blackmail. I questioned my own motivations. I wanted justice, yes, but what kind of justice? One that would destroy her completely, or one that would make her confront her actions, but still give her a chance at redemption? I remembered Clara's words, who always said that true strength was in forgiving, not in retaliating in kind. But how could I forgive something so painful? Amidst this storm of thoughts, something ignited in me, It wasn't a desire for Anna's salvation, not yet, but a need to understand the extent of the trap she had fallen into. I needed to go beyond the legal, beyond the accusations and counter-accusations. I needed to look into the eyes of the one pulling the strings, the one benefiting from my daughter's misfortune. It was an impulse that came from a deep place, a place the calculating businessman had buried, but that the father still held. I needed to confront Sonia. When I called Richard to lay out my idea, there was a prolonged silence on the other end of the line. He, a man of laws and strategies, was visibly surprised. "Arthur, that's dangerous," he warned, his voice heavy with concern. "Sonia is a blackmailer. She won't hesitate to use any information she can get from you. It's better to let Elias handle this, or let justice run its course." I understood his concern, but my decision was made. "Richard, I have to do this. I can't stand by while my daughter sinks deeper, not to defend her, but to try and understand the true nature of this web." Elias, when he heard of my intention, was more pragmatic. He didn't try to dissuade me with moral arguments, but with the logic of the danger. "Mr. Collins, she's a manipulator, and more importantly, she's already holding all the cards. What do you intend to offer her?" My answer was simple, though still a bit uncertain. "I don't intend to offer anything, Elias. I intend to listen, and maybe, just maybe, find a crack where compassion or common sense might still exist." Elias, with a resigned sigh, promised to help me make contact as safely as possible, ensuring I wouldn't be alone in this risky endeavor. The thought of meeting the woman who was ruining Anna's life sent a shiver down my spine, but also a strange sense of power. I wasn't going as a father begging for his daughter, but as a man seeking the truth behind a family tragedy. I was taking a risk. I knew Sonia could be even more relentless than I imagined, and my actions could have unpredictable consequences, perhaps even worsening Anna's situation. But there was something inside me that wouldn't let me back down. Elias gave me Sonia's contact, a phone number with a warning. "She's cautious, sir. Don't expect her to answer on the first try." I held the phone for a long time, the weight of fate seeming to rest on my fingers. The air in the hotel room was heavy with expectation. I knew that by making that call, I would be crossing a line. There was no turning back. It was a step on an unknown path. A risky move in a game I wasn't sure I could win. With a deep sigh, I gathered all my courage and finally dialed the number. What would I say? What would she reply? I felt that my life, and Anna's, was about to take a completely new turn. The voice on the other end would tell me if I was walking towards salvation or to an even greater precipice. The call to Sonia was an act of mixed courage and desperation. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drum echoing in my ears. Her voice, when she finally answered, was cold and calculating, without a hint of emotion. She didn't recognize me at first, and I introduced myself as Arthur, Anna's father. There was a loaded silence on the other end, a delayed recognition, and then her voice became a bit harsher, tinged with suspicion and caution. "What do you want?" she asked bluntly. I knew I couldn't come with a request, nor with a plea. I had to be strategic, direct. "I know about the blackmail, Sonia," I said, my voice sounding firmer than I felt. "I know about the tax fraud and the amount you're demanding from Anna." The silence that followed was even thicker. I could almost feel her mind working, trying to decipher my intentions. "And what do you plan to do with that information?" she finally questioned, an implicit challenge in her words. "I plan to understand," I replied, with an honesty that surprised me. "I plan to understand why you're destroying my daughter's life. I know she made a mistake, and she must pay for it, but there's a fine line between justice and cruelty." I didn't expect her to be moved, but I wanted to see her reaction, to deepen my understanding of her motivation. She laughed, a dry, joyless laugh. "Justice? Where was your justice when she left me with all the losses from that failed business? Where was your justice when she got off scot-free while I carried the weight of the blame?" Her words were a gush of resentment, of bitterness accumulated over the years. Her voice, once cold, now rose, laden with a contained anger, an unresolved pain. It was then that Elias, who was discreetly following me in a rented car nearby, called me. He had noticed suspicious movement near my hotel, a figure he recognized as one of the collectors hounding Mark. "Arthur, don't drag this out, they're close." The urgency in Elias's voice made me realize I needed to be more incisive. "Sonia, you're being used," I said, turning my attention back to the call with her. "Mark is drowning in gambling debts. The money from the house wasn't for your blackmail. It was to pay his debts, debts that are only growing. You're just another victim in this scheme." There was a stunned silence on the other end. The information, I knew, had caught her by surprise. She hadn't considered that possibility. "What are you implying?" she asked, her voice now a bit weaker, her once unshakable certainty beginning to crumble. "I'm implying that you're in the middle of a family battle that doesn't concern you," I replied. "And I'm suggesting that maybe there's a way for all of us to get out of this without more destruction. Anna made a mistake in the past. Yes, but Mark is dragging everyone into an abyss. Do you want revenge for a mistake from years ago? Or do you want your share of money that might not even exist anymore?" The tension in the air was palpable. I could feel Sonia's mind working frantically, processing the new information. She hadn't considered that the money she demanded could have been diverted to pay Mark's gambling debts. For her, the sale of the house was the guarantee of her blackmail. The possibility that she too was being manipulated, that her years of resentment might be being exploited, was an unexpected turning point. I knew I had struck a nerve. "I need to think," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "Don't call me again. I'll contact you if there's anything to discuss." And she hung up. I knew the conversation hadn't been a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. I had planted a seed of doubt, of uncertainty in her mind. She hadn't expected me to know so much, or that I would reveal to her the depth of Mark's financial problems. The information about Mark's gambling, I felt, was the element that could turn the game in my favor, as she was not Mark's ally, but someone who wanted her own money back. But the question now was, how would she use this information, and what would Anna, submerged in her own web of lies and blackmail, do in the face of such a crucial new development? I felt the battle was far from over, and that Sonia's next move would be decisive. I had opened a new front, and the consequences would be unpredictable. The silence of the phone after the call with Sonia was more eloquent than any shout. I sat on the edge of the bed, my hands sweaty, my heart still racing. I had planted the seed of discord, a bug in the ear of a woman who, until then, saw herself as the sole victim and the sole executioner. Sonia's contained anger, the way she spoke of her old grudge with Anna, made me understand that she wasn't acting just for greed, but for a deep desire for retribution. I had given her a new perspective, the idea that she, too, was being manipulated. The uncertainty of what she would do with this information was an overwhelming weight. I hoped the revelation about Mark's debts would make her rethink her strategy, but I wasn't sure. The days that followed were an agonizing wait. Richard called me frequently to update me on the progress of the Millers' lawsuit against Anna, which was dragging on with new motions and responses. The tactics I had planted about the lawyer Davies were taking effect, making the Millers more cautious and less likely to blindly trust their defense. There were reports of heated arguments between the in-laws and Anna, picked up by Elias in his reports. The house, once the stage of my betrayal, was now becoming a battlefield for them. The anguish for Anna, as much as I fought against it, grew in my chest. I had been the instrument to destabilize her life, to bring to light truths she had desperately tried to hide. But I couldn't deny that she had dug her own grave. She had chosen the path of lies and betrayal, and now she was facing the consequences. However, The image of my daughter, kneeling in despair for having abandoned me, haunted my thoughts. Was she regretting it, or just feeling the weight of the consequences? Elias, the investigator, continued to be my eyes and ears. His reports, delivered by a discreet messenger, were the only window to the world outside. One afternoon, I received a thicker envelope than usual. Inside, besides the usual report, were some photos taken from a distance. They were of Anna. She looked thin, with deep, dark circles under her eyes. The sparkle in her eyes was gone, replaced by an expression of exhaustion and despair. In one of the photos, she was on the phone, her face contorted in a mixture of fury and fear. Elias speculated she was talking to Sonia. The news of the interaction between Sonia and Anna came a few days later. Elias had managed to intercept some information. Sonia, enraged at the possibility of Mark having diverted the money she expected for his own debts, had confronted Anna aggressively. The blackmail had intensified, and Sonia not only demanded the money, but now threatened to expose the tax fraud immediately if she didn't receive it. The pressure on Anna, already immense with the lawsuit from her in-laws and my own action, had become unbearable. She was in a dead end. I found myself thinking about how Anna must be feeling, crushed from all sides. It was a feeling I knew well, though for different reasons. Compassion, which I fought so hard to suppress, began to sprout again. However, it was quickly suffocated by the memory of Anna's cold gaze when she blocked me at the door of my own home. The line between anger and pity was thin, and I was walking it with increasing difficulty. The Millers, for their part, were becoming more aggressive. The information about Mark's debts, combined with the failed house sale and the apparent incompetence of their lawyer, was driving them into a frenzy. They feared they had lost a large sum of money and were determined to hold Anna and Mark responsible for it. The battle in court would become even more fierce with the introduction of the forgery evidence Richard was preparing. I knew I was on the brink of a major confrontation. Anna was cornered, Sonia furious, and the Millers relentless. The final act in court was approaching, and I felt it would be the stage for the most painful of revelations. But before I could even imagine the outcome, I received a phone call that left me paralyzed. It wasn't Richard, nor Elias. It was an unknown number. I hesitated, but answered. The voice on the other end was weak, choked with tears. It was Anna. "Dad, I can't take it anymore," she whispered, and then the line went dead. What couldn't she take? And what did this call mean for the outcome of our story? My heart ached in a way I hadn't felt since the day Clara left me. The click of Anna's call ending, followed by the silence, echoed in the hotel room like a gunshot. "Dad, I can't take it anymore." Her whispered, desperate words were stuck in my mind. A wave of panic hit me. Despite all the anger and pain she had caused, she was still my daughter. What couldn't she take anymore? Had the siege from Sonia, the Millers, and in a way, even me, pushed her to the edge? My hands trembled as I tried to call back, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I immediately called Richard, my voice filled with an urgency he had rarely heard from me. I explained Anna's call, the desperate tone in her voice. Richard, with his characteristic calm, tried to reassure me. "Arthur, let's keep a cool head. She's under a lot of pressure. This could be a cry for help, a way of giving in." But I felt it was more than that. The panic in her voice was palpable. Meanwhile, Elias brought me fresh news. He had been monitoring Sonia and discovered that upon learning Mark had used the money from the house sale to cover gambling debts, not to pay the blackmail, she had changed her strategy. She no longer just wanted Anna's money. She wanted to see the whole circus burn. Sonia, in her fury, had approached the Millers, presenting them with proof of the old tax fraud she and Anna had committed. Sonia's intention was clear. If she couldn't get her money, no one would have peace. She wanted revenge and was willing to play all her cards, exposing everyone. The Millers, already furious with Anna and Mark, saw a new weapon in Sonia's information. Now, in addition to the fraud in the house sale, they had a new element to use against Anna, the past tax fraud. Anna's situation was becoming untenable. She was being attacked from all sides, with an accumulation of accusations that could ruin her professional and personal life forever. The prospect of the trial was fast approaching, and I knew it would be a cruel spectacle. I no longer had control over events. The avalanche Anna had triggered with her choices and lies was now crashing down on her with full force, and I, as much as my father's heart ached, could no longer protect her. My initial intention of just getting my house back had turned into a fight for the truth and the consequences of her actions. That day, while I tried in vain to get Anna to answer my calls, Richard called me with news that made my stomach turn. The miller's lawyer, Mr. Davies, taking advantage of the new information provided by Sonia, had filed an amendment to the lawsuit against Anna. Now, in addition to the fraud in the house sale, he was including the accusation of tax fraud. The web was tightening even further, and Anna's future looked increasingly bleak. I felt like a helpless spectator watching a shipwreck in slow motion. The image of Clara, with her compassion and wisdom, filled my thoughts. What would she do? She always believed in redemption, in people's ability to learn from their mistakes. But Anna had gone so far. Could there be redemption for her? And did I, as a father, have the right to intervene to try to save my daughter from a cliff she had dug herself? Amid this turmoil, a new and strange feeling began to settle in me, a mixture of apprehension and a twinge of hope. If Anna was at her limit, if she had finally reached the point of not being able to take it anymore, perhaps it meant she was ready to face the truth. Perhaps it was her chance to truly repent, to break free from the influence of Mark and Sonia, to rebuild her life. However difficult it might be, however, the price of this possible redemption would be high. Very high. I didn't know if she would have the strength to face the consequences of her actions, to take responsibility for every mistake. The scene in the courthouse, I knew, would be the stage not just for a legal dispute, but for an emotional confrontation that would change our lives forever. I prepared myself for what was to come, knowing that the pain would be inevitable, but with a small, almost imperceptible flame of hope that, in the end, the truth, however cruel, might bring some form of healing. I felt the climax was near, and that Anna's fate and mine would be decided there. Anna's disconnected call hammered in my head, a constant echo of her despair. "Dad, I can't take it anymore." The words were a painful reminder that, despite everything, she was still my daughter, the one I had held in my arms and taught to walk. I tried for hours to call back, but with no success. Her phone remained silent, increasing my anguish and sense of helplessness. The father's heart in me struggled between fury at the betrayal and the pain of seeing her in such a deep abyss. Richard, my lawyer, tried to calm me, but the seriousness of his tone did not go unnoticed. He was focused on preparing our strategy for the rapidly approaching trial. "Arthur, our priority is to secure your right to the life estate and prove the forgery of your signature. That is irrefutable." His words were logically sound, but my heart was elsewhere, torn between the pursuit of justice and the desire to protect my own flesh and blood from imminent ruin. It was an emotional tightrope, and every step was torture. Elias continued to be my shadow, my eyes and ears in the outside world. His reports became more frequent and darker. Anna was visibly shaken. He had caught her in a few moments, always alone, her face pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked like a ghost, wandering the streets, avoiding contact even with Mark, who, according to Elias, was increasingly isolated, trying to evade his own creditors and the lawsuit the Millers were pursuing against him. The house, my house, was now a stage for a silent war, with the Millers on one side and Anna, a lonely and frightened figure, on the other. Sonia, for her part, was acting more cunningly than I had imagined. After my call, she had not only approached the Millers with information about Anna's tax fraud, but had also somehow leaked details about the dubious reputation of the lawyer, Davies, to the press. The seed I had planted about Davies was bearing fruit in unexpected ways, and now Sonia was using the same tactic to destabilize the situation. The media began to weave a complex narrative about a family scandal involving fraud, blackmail, and a dispute over an inheritance. The story spread like wildfire, and my family's name was being dragged through the mud. With each passing day, the tension mounted, not just in my life, but in the entire web of relationships that surrounded me. The Millers, who once just wanted their money back, were now thirsty for revenge, feeling doubly deceived. They saw Anna as the mastermind behind everything, the person who had orchestrated the fraud of the house and the past. Their fury was palpable, and I knew they would show no mercy in court. I found myself imagining Anna alone, facing the weight of all these accusations, the girl who laughed and played in the garden with Clara, the ambitious young woman who dreamed of conquering the world, and now the cornered woman who had lost herself in a labyrinth of lies and wrong choices. My heart ached at the thought of having to testify against her, of having to present the evidence of her forgery. A part of me refused to believe the depth of her fall, but the other part knew the truth had to come out. On one of my rare outings from the hotel, I ran into an old friend, Paul, who was a neighbor from my old house. With a sad expression, he approached me and said, "Arthur, I'm so sorry for what's happening. I saw your daughter the other day. She looked desolate. Clara's roses, they've all been torn out. It's a shame. No one deserves to go through this, my friend." His simple, genuinely compassionate words opened a crack in the wall I was trying to build around my heart. Clara's roses, such a vivid symbol of her presence, had been ripped out, just like the hope I had been holding on to. Despite everything, a small, almost imperceptible flame of hope stubbornly flickered. The idea that this complete collapse, this public humiliation, could be the catalyst for Anna to finally see the reality of her actions, that maybe, just maybe, at rock bottom, she would find the strength to rise again. But for that, she would have to face everything, and I knew the court would be the stage for this brutal confrontation, where not just legality, but the most intimate and painful truth of our family would be exposed. The trial date was set for the following week. Anna's fate, my fate, the fate of our family, was about to be sealed, and I knew there was no turning back. The stage was set, and the curtains were about to open for the final act. The day of the trial dawned grey and rainy, as if the sky mirrored the storm that had descended upon my family. I put on the suit Clara had loved so much, feeling the weight of the fabric and the expectations. My body, though still frail from my recovery, was driven by an iron determination. Richard was by my side, a pillar of calm and professionalism. He went over the final details, the evidence, the testimonies. I just nodded, my mind already in the courtroom, prepared for the confrontation. We arrived at the courthouse under the glare of a few reporters who had been drawn by the story spreading in the press. The family scandal, the betrayal, the house at the center of it all, it was a feast for them. I avoided their gazes and questions, focusing only on what was to come. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense, the air heavy. The Millers were there with their lawyers, Mr. Davies at the forefront, displaying an arrogant posture I already knew. They looked at me with a mixture of anger and disdain, as if I were to blame for all their misfortune. Anna entered shortly after tea, accompanied by her own lawyer, a young and inexperienced professional who seemed overwhelmed by the gravity of the situation. Seeing her, my heart broke a little. She was even thinner, her face pale and drawn, her eyes downcast, not daring to meet mine. Her hands were clasped in front of her, almost as if in supplication. The haughtiness, the coldness from before, was gone. The woman who had blocked me at the door of my own home had vanished, replaced by a fragile and frightened figure. She sat at the defendant's table, distant, almost hidden. The judge, a woman with a serious demeanor and a piercing gaze, began the session. The lawyers presented their arguments, accusations flying across the room. The miller's defense focused on the fraud of the house sale and, now with Sonia's information, on Anna's tax fraud. Davies, with his sharp rhetoric and his propensity for personal attacks, did not spare Anna. He painted her as a manipulator, a criminal who had deceived everyone, including me, her own father. I watched Anna shrink with every word, her posture betraying her pain and shame. Then it was my turn to testify. Richard guided me with clear and objective questions. I recounted the story from the beginning: the illness, the return home, the strange car, the uprooted rose bushes, Anna's cold words. My voice, though choked with emotion at times, remained firm. I told them about the living trust, about the life estate that guaranteed my right to the house. And then came the most painful moment. Richard asked me to confirm the authenticity of the signature on the life estate waiver document. I took the paper in my hands, my fingers brushing against the forged ink. A lump formed in my throat. I looked at Anna, who finally lifted her eyes and met mine. In her gaze, I saw a mixture of pleading, despair, and a remorse that seemed genuine. It was the girl I knew, my daughter, not the stranger who had betrayed me. This is not my signature," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but it reverberated throughout the courtroom. "This is not my handwriting." The room fell silent. The words, simple and true, were irrefutable proof of the forgery. That was the final blow, the evidence she could not contest. Richard then didn't make a request. He made a demonstration. With the judge's permission, he presented the recording obtained by Elias, a clear recording where Anna's and Mark's voices openly discussed forging my signature and the plan to leave me destitute. Every word was a knife in my heart, but it was the truth, cold and undeniable. In the recording, Mark seemed to pressure Anna, and her voice, though reluctant, agreed. The complicity, the coldness with which they planned to dispossess me, was shocking. The judge, visibly shocked by the coldness of the act and the audacity of Anna and Mark, banged her gavel. Considering the evidence presented, the forgery of the signature, and the legally established life estate, this court annuls the sale of the property. Mr. Collins is the rightful life tenant of the property. As for the other charges, she began, but her voice was lost to me. The room was spinning, and a mix of relief and sadness washed over me. I had won the battle for the house, but at a very high cost. What would become of Anna now? I felt that the most critical moment was yet to come, not in the courtroom, but outside it, where true emotional justice would be forged. The sound of the judge's gavel still echoed in my ears, and I knew it was just the beginning of a new and painful chapter. The judge's decision reverberated through the courtroom, a sound that for me meant victory and, at the same time, a deep bitterness. The sale of the house had been annulled. My home, the sanctuary of my memories with Clara, was safe. An immense weight was lifted from my shoulders, but the feeling of relief was quickly suffocated by the image of Anna, pale and shrunken, absorbing every word from the judge. The cost of that legal victory was the ruin of my own daughter. Still dazed, I was led by Richard out of the courtroom. The atmosphere in the hallway was chaotic. Reporters with cameras and microphones surrounded us, eager for a statement. I refused to speak. I just wanted to get out of there, to breathe air that wasn't laden with grief and resentment. As I tried to break free from the crowd, I heard a muffled whisper, a sound that made me stop in my tracks. "Dad." I turned, and there she was. Anna was there, on the cold marble floor of the courthouse, kneeling. The arrogance, the coldness from before, was gone. Her face was covered in tears that flowed freely, washing away the mask of hardness she had worn for so long. She wasn't begging me for the house, nor for her legal freedom. She was begging for something much deeper. "Dad, forgive me," she sobbed, her voice choked with pain and remorse. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." The father in me wanted to hug her, to pull her close and console her. The pain in her eyes was genuine, a reflection of the abyss she had fallen into. But the man she betrayed, the man who had been thrown out of his own home, the man who had fought pneumonia alone, prevailed. I looked at her, kneeling there, and felt a complex mix of feelings. The fury was still there, but now it mixed with an overwhelming sadness and a glimpse of compassion. "Anna," I said, my voice low and firm, "you barred me from my own home. You forged my signature. You planned to leave me with nothing while I was fighting for my life." Each word was a shard of glass, but I needed her to understand the depth of what she had done. Tears streamed down her face, not of self-pity, but of pure terror and regret. She confessed everything: Mark's debt, Sonia's blackmail, the panic that led her to commit that atrocity. She told me how the pressure had changed her, how she felt cornered, with no other way out. The desperation in her voice was palpable, and I could see in her tear-filled eyes the girl I had lost, now emerging from her own shadows. The father in me wavered. Compassion threatened to overwhelm me, but I knew I needed more than words. She needed to understand that actions have consequences. I looked her in the eyes, and my voice, though still heavy with pain, grew stronger. "Anna, I can forgive you as a father, but you need to pay for what you did, not to me, but to yourself and to the principles you abandoned." I made my demand, one I had pondered during the long, sleepless nights at the hotel. "I want you and Mark to sign a document renouncing any claim to my inheritance and my assets forever. You will lose the financial comfort you expected, but you will gain the chance to start over without the shadows of the past haunting you. You will have the chance to build your own life, with honesty and hard work." Her face contorted, and for a moment I thought she would refuse. But then, with trembling hands, she nodded. Richard, who had witnessed the entire scene, quickly prepared the documents. Anna signed, the pen scratching the paper, an act that sealed not just her renunciation of the inheritance, but also the end of an era for our family. Mark, who was hiding in some corner, was found by Elias and No, under the threat of having his debts publicly exposed and his name dragged into an even bigger criminal case. Also signed, without a word. She had lost financial comfort, yes, but I felt that, at that moment, something much deeper had been lost by her and by me. I had lost the daughter I knew, and she, the innocence and security of a father. The scene in the courthouse hallway, with Anna on her knees and my demands, was the end of that cycle of pain. It was a resolution that brought justice, but carried the weight of sadness and an uncertain future. I knew the house was mine again, but the home, the family, would never be the same. What remained now was to rebuild, not just my life, but what was left of myself, and maybe, just maybe, one day, what was left of my relationship with Anna. The dust settled slowly after the whirlwind at the courthouse. The house was mine again. But its possession brought with it the painful memory of all that had happened. It was no longer the sanctuary of memories I had envisioned. Clara's rose bushes had been ripped out, a symbol of a destruction that extended far beyond the garden. The hospital smell, which had haunted me for so long, now mixed with the scent of a betrayal that permeated the walls of my home. I couldn't see the house the same way anymore. After signing the renunciation agreement, Anna left, and I didn't see her for a while. Mark, with his debts and his trail of problems, also disappeared, likely fleeing his creditors and the consequences of his actions. The Millers, though upset about the lost deal, turned their attention back to their own lives, no longer interested in getting involved in my family's tragedy. Sonia, for her part, seeing that she wouldn't get the money from Anna, and with the threat of having her name exposed in the press for blackmail. Backed off. The legal battle was over, but the emotional one was just beginning. I spent a few days in the house, trying to reconnect with the walls, with the memories, but in every corner I saw Anna, not the girl who grew up there, but the woman who betrayed me. The echo of her cold words and the glint of triumph in Mr. Miller's eyes were ghosts that haunted me. I couldn't live there anymore. It was a constant reminder of a pain I needed to heal, a wound I needed to close. I decided to sell the house. The decision was difficult, but necessary. It was the stage of that betrayal, the epicenter of a pain I needed to leave behind. Richard helped me with the sale, finding a buyer who valued the property, but who, to me, would be nothing more than a means to a new beginning. With the money from the sale, I looked for a smaller, simpler place in a quiet neighborhood, far from the bitter memories. A place where I could finally find some peace. With the remaining amount from the sale, and with a significant part of my assets, I made a decision that would change the course not only of my life, but also of many others. I created a foundation, named in honor of Clara, my eternal companion. The Clara Foundation, Shelter and Justice. The goal was simple, yet ambitious. To offer free legal aid and psychological support to parents in situations of abandonment. Just as I had been barred from the door of my home, but now I would open a door of hope for many others. The first few months were challenging. I dedicated myself body and soul to the foundation, working alongside Richard and a small team of dedicated professionals. Seeing the glimmer of hope in the eyes of people who arrived destitute, not knowing where to turn, was the greatest reward. I shared my story, not to play the victim, but to show that even in the deepest pain, there is a path to recovery and transformation. The foundation became my new purpose, my new home. Over time, the anger subsided, and the sadness gave way to a serene acceptance. I didn't expect an easy forgiveness from Anna, nor her return, but the wound slowly began to heal. One day, months later, I received a letter. It was from Anna. The handwriting was different, more mature, more conscious. She didn't ask for forgiveness again, but she recounted her journey. She had separated from Mark, who had finally been confronted with his debts. She was working hard, rebuilding her life from scratch, learning to value honesty and independence. She mentioned seeing news about the foundation and that she felt a strange pride in me. In her words, I felt a flicker of redemption, not for me, but for her. I forgave her, not with words spoken to her, but in my own heart. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, but releasing the weight of resentment. The story taught me that life, even when it hits us with the cruelest of betrayals, offers a chance to start over, to transform pain into purpose. I had been a man who built a house with love, who was driven from it with coldness, but who, in the end, rebuilt not only himself, but also hope for others. And that, I knew, was the greatest legacy Clara and I could leave.